Welcome to DCF Investigations. There are places in this world where the silence of the forest feels less like peace and more like a held breath, where the towering pines of the American wilderness stand as silent sentinels over secrets that refuse to stay buried. We're traveling back to a time of analog isolation, to a small, decaying resort town in the Sierra Nevada mountains of Northern California. The year is 1981. The location is a rustic, seemingly idyllic retreat known as Keddie. What happened inside the walls of Cabin 28 remains one of the most brutal, perplexing, and terrifying unsolved mysteries in the annals of American crime. This is not just a story about a murder. It is a story about a family seeking a fresh start, a community riddled with dark undercurrents, and a justice system that may have failed to look at the monsters standing in plain sight. Tonight, we open the file on the Keddie Cabin Murders. To truly understand the horror of April 11th, 1981, we must first immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of the location. Keddie, California, located in Plumas County, was not a booming tourist destination at the time. It was a former railroad town, originally built by the Western Pacific Railroad in 1910 to house workers. By the early 1980s, it had fallen into a state of semi-dilapidation. The cabins, identical wooden structures lined up among the trees, were owned by a local businessman who rented them out to low-income families and drifters. It was a place where people went to disappear or to start over when they had nowhere else to go. The isolation was palpable. The town is nestled in the Feather River Canyon, a place of breathtaking natural beauty, but also deep shadows. At night, the darkness in Keddie is absolute, swallowed by the dense canopy of the forest. Into this setting came Glenna Susan Sharp, known to her friends and family as Sue. Sue was 36 years old, a mother of 5 who had recently escaped a tumultuous and abusive marriage on the East Coast. She had packed up her life in Connecticut and driven across the country, seeking sanctuary and stability for her children. They arrived in California in 1979 and eventually settled in Keddie in November of 1980, renting Cabin 28. By all accounts, Sue was a devoted mother, trying to make ends meet on a meager income, taking classes at a nearby college, and attempting to raise her children in a wholesome environment. She was known for her kindness, but also for her quiet privacy. She was rebuilding a life that had been fractured, and for a few months, Cabin 28 seemed like a safe harbor. Living in the cabin with Sue were her 5 children: 15-year-old John, 14-year-old Sheila, 12-year-old Tina, 10-year-old Rick, and 5-year-old Greg. The cabin itself was small, a simple structure with a living room, a kitchen, and bedrooms that offered little in the way of soundproofing. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's business, simply because the walls were thin and the cabins were clustered close together. Cabin 28 was situated just a few hundred feet from the neighbor's house, Cabin 26, a proximity that would become a crucial and chilling detail in the investigation. The days leading up to the tragedy were unremarkable, filled with the mundane rhythms of family life. It was the start of spring break. The air was crisp, and the community was settling into the weekend. On the morning of April 11th, 1981, the Sharp household was active. Sue was home with the younger boys. Sheila had plans to spend the night at a friend's house nearby, the Seabolt residence. John, the eldest son, had gone into the nearby town of Quincy with his friend, 17-year-old Dana Wingate. John and Dana were inseparable, typical teenagers of the era who enjoyed rock music and the freedom of the mountains. They spent the day hanging out, likely unaware that they were living the final hours of their lives. As the sun began to set over the canyon, the atmosphere in Keddie shifted. Sheila left for her sleepover, a decision that would ultimately save her life. In cabin 28, Sue remained with the two younger boys, Rick and Greg, and a young friend of theirs, Justin Eason. Justin was just 12 years old, the stepson of a neighbor, Marty Smartt, who lived in cabin 26. The three young boys eventually went to sleep in the back bedroom, a room that would become an island of survival in a sea of carnage. John and Donna were seen hitchhiking back from Quincy in the late afternoon. They were picked up and dropped off closer to Keddie. The timeline suggests they returned to cabin 28 sometime later that evening, likely walking into a nightmare that was already in progress, or perhaps bringing the killer with them, though the evidence suggests the former is more probable. What happened inside cabin 28 between the late hours of April 11th and the early morning of April 12th has been reconstructed through forensic evidence, blood spatter analysis, and the chilling silence of the aftermath. It appears that at least two individuals entered the cabin. They were armed with weapons of brutal efficiency, a claw hammer and a steak knife. The attack began in the living room. Sue Sharp was seemingly the primary target or the first to be subdued. The violence inflicted upon her was personal and frenzied. She was bound with electrical wire and medical tape. The attackers did not just want to kill, they wanted to control and destroy. When John and Dana entered the cabin, they likely walked in on the attack. John, defending his mother, was bludgeoned and stabbed. Dana, a bystander caught in the crossfire, suffered a similar fate. The struggle was ferocious. Furniture was overturned, and blood was cast across the walls and ceiling, indicating the sheer force of the blows. The killers were methodical enough to bind the victims, yet chaotic enough to leave a scene of absolute pandemonium. In the back bedroom, mere feet away from the slaughter, Rick, Greg, and Justin slept. It defies logic and comprehension that they remained asleep through the commotion. Some theories suggest they were threatened into silence, while others propose they slept through it due to the noise of the television or the layout of the house. However, Justin Eason would later provide conflicting and suppressed accounts that suggested he may have seen more than he initially revealed. The sun rose on April 12th, Easter Sunday morning. The forest was quiet. At approximately 7:45 a.m., Sheila Sharp returned home from her sleepover. She walked up the wooden steps to cabin 28, expecting to change clothes for church. When she opened the front door, her mind could not immediately process what she was seeing. In the living room lay three bodies. They were bound with wire and tape, covered in yellow blankets that had been taken from the beds. The room was a slaughterhouse. Sheila, in a state of shock, ran out of the cabin screaming. She rushed back to the Seabolt neighbors, who helped her contact the authorities. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department responded to the scene, but the initial handling of the investigation would become a source of controversy for decades. Deputies entered the cabin and confirmed the deaths of Sue Sharp, John Sharp, and Dana Wingate. But as they processed the scene, they realized something terrifying. There was a fourth victim missing. 12-year-old Tina Sharp was nowhere to be found. The boys in the back room, Rick, Greg, and Justin, were found unharmed. They were brought out of the cabin through the bedroom window to spare them the sight of the horror in the living room. They claimed to have slept through the night, unaware of the massacre occurring just on the other side of the door. This detail has haunted investigators. How could 3 boys sleep through the brutal murder of 3 people in a small wooden cabin? The crime scene was a labyrinth of clues and contradictions. The killers had used weapons found within the home, such as the steak knife, but also brought weapons with them, specifically the hammer. The medical tape used to bind the victims was a specific type, leaving investigators to wonder where it came from. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting the attackers were either known to the victims or the door had been left unlocked. The autopsies revealed the savagery of the attack. Sue Sharp had been beaten with a hammer and stabbed multiple times. The throat of one victim had been slashed. The blunt force trauma was severe. This was not a robbery gone wrong. Nothing of significant value appeared to be missing. This was rage. This was personal. As the investigation launched, the focus quickly turned to the locals. In a community as small as Keddie, everyone was a suspect. But 2 names rose to the top of the list almost immediately. Marty Smartt and his house guest, John Boubede. Marty Smartt lived in Cabin 26, the neighboring unit. He was a Vietnam veteran who reportedly suffered from PTSD and had a history of domestic turbulence. His wife, Marilyn Smartt, was friends with Sue Sharp. Rumors swirled that Marilyn was confiding in Sue about leaving Marty, and that Marty had discovered this betrayal. Was Sue Sharp killed because she was counseling Marilyn to leave her abusive husband? This provided a strong, clear motive. Living with the Smarts was Boubede, a man with a mysterious and checkered past. Boubede was believed to have connections to organized crime in Chicago or Las Vegas, though these links were often exaggerated by local gossip. He was an ex-convict and a close friend of Marty. On the night of the murders, Marty and Bo had been seen at the back door bar in Quincy. They were reportedly drinking heavily and acting aggressively. They claimed they returned to Cabin 26 and went to sleep, but their alibis were porous. Marty Smartt became the prime person of interest for several reasons. First, his stepson, Justin, was the 3rd boy in the back bedroom, the one who was spared. Would a stranger have left a witness alive? Or did the killer spare the boys because he knew one of them? Furthermore, shortly after the murders, Marty reported to the police that he had lost a hammer. He described it in detail. This preemptive declaration struck investigators as incredibly suspicious, as if he were trying to explain away a weapon that might be found later. Then came the behavior of the sheriff's department. Critics and later investigators have alleged that the relationship between Marty Smartt and the local law enforcement was too cozy. Smartt had worked briefly as a cook at a local hotel frequented by deputies. There are allegations that the initial investigation was botched, either through incompetence or willful ignorance. Evidence was reportedly mishandled. Interviews were not conducted with the rigor required for a triple homicide. For 3 years, the case went cold. The community of Keddie withered, the shadow of the murders driving people away. The cabin stood empty, a grim monument to the violence. But the mystery of the missing girl, Tina Sharp, remained an open wound. The FBI had been involved in the search for her, operating on the theory that she had been abducted by the killers, perhaps because she had witnessed the start of the attack or because she was a specific target. In April 1984, 3 years to the month after the murders. A bottle collector wandering in the woods near Camp 18, a remote area about 29 miles away from Keddie, made a grisly discovery. He found a human cranium. Dental records confirmed it was Sheila Sharp. The rest of her remains were found nearby, along with a child's blanket. The location of the body was significant. It was a difficult area to access, suggesting the killer knew the terrain well. The discovery changed the profile of the crime. This wasn't just a home invasion. It was a kidnapping and disposal. It implied that the killers had a vehicle and the presence of mind to transport a body and a witness while covered in blood, or that they returned later. Despite this breakthrough, no arrests were made. Marty Smartt moved away from Keddie, eventually relocating to Oregon. Boubede reportedly died in 1988. The case seemed destined to fade into obscurity, another unsolved tragedy in the vast American wilderness. However, the story of the Keddie murders is one of persistence. In the early 2000s, and again in the 2010s, new investigators took a fresh look at the case. Pluma's County Sheriff Hagwood and Special Investigator Mike Gamberg began to uncover evidence that had been overlooked or buried in the files. They found a recording of an anonymous 911 call that had been dismissed years earlier. They found boxes of evidence that had been sealed and forgotten. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence to resurface was a letter written by Marty Smartt to his wife, Marilyn. In the letter, penned shortly after the murders when the couple was separating, Marty wrote, "I've paid the price of your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we are through." The letter seems to be a glaring, unequivocal confession. He mentions 4 people's lives. At the time the letter was likely written, Tina was missing but presumed dead by the killer. This letter was in the possession of the authorities, but was never acted upon sufficient to secure conviction. Marilyn Smartt later claimed she gave the letter to the police, but it languished in a file. Furthermore, investigators revisited the testimony of Justin Eason. Under hypnosis, which was a technique used at the time, Justin had described seeing men in the living room. He described a boat on the water, a detail that seemed nonsensical until investigators realized he might have been describing a dreamlike state or a conflated memory. But more lucidly, he spoke of hearing noises. In later years, it was revealed that Justin had told others that he saw his stepfather, Marty, in the house that night. In 2016, a significant physical discovery was made. A hammer was found in a dried-up pond near Keddie. The location of the pond matched a spot where Marty Smartt claimed to have lost a hammer decades earlier. The hammer matched the description of the weapon Marty said he lost, and it was consistent with the blunt force injuries found on the victims. It was rusted and decayed, but it was a tangible link to the suspect who had walked free. We must also explore the conspiracy theories that have sprouted around this case like weeds. Some believe the murders were connected to drug trafficking. Plumas County in the 1980s had issues with drug manufacturing in the deep woods. Was Boubede an enforcer sent to settle a debt? Was John Sharp involved in something over his head? These theories, while cinematic, often lack the hard evidence that points toward the domestic motive. The savagery of the attack on Sue Sharp suggests a crime of passion, a release of pent-up hatred rather than a professional hit. Professional killers rarely use hammers found at the scene or steak knives from the kitchen drawer. They come prepared. The chaotic nature of the Keddie crime scene screams of an explosion of personal violence. Another theory posits that the sheriff's department was protecting Marty Smartt because he was an informant or had leverage over officers. While corruption in small-town police departments is a trope of true crime, in this case, the incompetence seems just as likely as malice. The failure to secure the scene, the failure to press Smartt on his alibi, and the loss of critical files point to a department that was overwhelmed and under-equipped for a crime of this magnitude. We also have to consider the psychological toll on the survivors. Sheila Sharp, who found her family slaughtered, has spent her life seeking answers. The 3 boys in the back room grew up in the shadow of that night. The trauma inflicted on that family did not end when the killers left the cabin. It rippled through generations. As we analyze the suspects today, Marty Smartt remains the focal point. He had the motive: anger at his wife and her friend Sue. He had the opportunity. He lived next door. He had the profile: a man with a history of violence and instability. He had the connection. His stepson was spared. And he practically confessed in a letter. Boubede acts as the accomplice, the friend who perhaps escalated the situation or assisted in the containment. The dynamic between the 2 men at the bar that night, aggressive drinking, sets the stage for a violent outburst. So why is this case unsolved? The primary suspects are dead. Marty Smartt died of cancer in Portland, Oregon in 2000. Boubede died in 1988. You cannot prosecute a dead man. However, law enforcement continues to work the case in hopes of identifying any living accomplices or simply to close the book officially for the sake of the surviving family members. There is DNA evidence that has been tested against national databases, but so far, no definitive match has implicated a living suspect who can be brought to trial. The cabin itself, Cabin 28, was demolished in 2004, along with several other condemned buildings in Keddie. For years, it stood as a macabre tourist attraction, drawing the curious and the morbid. Its destruction erased the physical scar on the landscape, but the memory remains. The ground where it stood is now just a patch of earth in the woods, reclaimed by nature. The legacy of the Keddie Cabin Murders is one of frustration. It represents the terrifying reality that justice is not guaranteed. It reminds us that sometimes the monsters walk away. It highlights the fragility of safety, that a locked door and a quiet town are no defense against determined evil. The image of the boys sleeping in the back room while their family was decimated just feet away is one of the most haunting scenarios imaginable. It begs the question, what did they hear? What did they suppress? And why were they allowed to live? The leading theory today is that Marty Smartt and Boubede went to the cabin to confront Sue. The situation escalated. A weapon was drawn. The rage took over. When John and Dana arrived, they were collateral damage, silenced to protect the identity of the attackers. Tina, perhaps waking up and entering the room, was taken to prevent her from identifying the men she likely knew. Her murder at a secondary location suggests a cold, calculated decision made after the initial frenzy had subsided. In recent years, the investigative team has stated they believe there are people still alive who know exactly what happened that night. People who have carried this secret for over 40 years. They are urging these individuals to come forward, to clear their conscience before they too pass away. As we stand here today, Looking back at 1981, the Keddie murders serve as a grim time capsule. We see the limitations of forensic science of the era. We see the dangers of domestic violence spilling over into catastrophic loss. And we see the enduring pain of a sister, Sheila, who walked up those steps on a Sunday morning and lost her world. The file on the Keddie Cabin murders is thick with reports, photos, and contradictions. But it lacks the one thing that matters most: a conclusion. The spirits of Sue, John, Dana, and Tina still wait for the final word. The woods of Plumas County keep their secrets well, but even the deepest silence can be broken. This has been a deep dive into one of America's most disturbing cold cases. The darkness of Cabin 28 is a story that is difficult to tell and even harder to forget. We at DCF Investigations are dedicated to keeping these stories alive, ensuring that the victims are not just footnotes in history, but people whose lives were stolen and whose justice is overdue. We want to know what you think. Based on the paid the price letter and the discovery of the hammer, do you believe the police deliberately protected Marty's Smartt? Or was it a tragic case of small-town incompetence? And why do you think the boys in the back room were spared when Tina was taken? These are the questions that keep investigators awake at night. Leave your theories in the comments below. Until next time, stay observant and remember that the truth is often hiding in the shadows.